No, it was really a challenge in organizing the chapters of the book and in organizing the panels and this show. I mean, there have been panels at some academic events over the past academic and at the Media Reform Conference, trying to create also dialogue within the academic community and with advocates, as I said. And it's hard to take so many issues that currently seem to be so diverse and to decide how to break down the chapters and to create some kind of continuity. And I think the first panel was easier with that. This one is a little more challenging. The first two chapters, as I mentioned before, John Piha of Carnegie Mellon and Rob Frieden of Penn State, deal with wireless and spectrum issues and the wireless industry in particular, in the case of Rob, while Ellen Goodman of Rutgers School of Law in Camden and Catherine Montgomery of American University deal with more content-oriented issues. I'm very careful about that because Catherine is always very sensitive that I would present her as the content czar or something of that sort. So I'm being very careful about that. So I will, as before, to my very disciplined colleagues, give you the floor, and I will wave to you at the 3-minute, 1-minute, and time's up intervals. John, please.
Hello, I'm John Piha. My day job these days is Chief Technologist at the Federal Communications Commission. I'm also on faculty at Carnegie Mellon University. So given the former, let me start with the disclaimers. Anything I say today is my own opinion, does not reflect that of the Commission, its leadership, past, present, or future. Also, in fact, this is a chapter I wrote last spring when I was a full-time professor at Carnegie Mellon, no affiliation with the FCC, and it should be viewed as such. And finally, I hope you'll understand if I do not engage in some discussions on issues that are currently before the Commission beyond anything that was written in this chapter. That said, I was invited by MIT, or perhaps ordered by MIT, to write on the topic of spectrum. I think in the broader community, this is perhaps an underappreciated issue, in that a shortage of available spectrum is an impediment to the growth of wireless industries and all the jobs that come with them. It is an impediment to the build out of wireless infrastructure, and for those communities still waiting for certain infrastructure, that's a big issue. It is an impediment to reducing the costs of various valuable products and services that exist today, and an impediment to innovation in the development of new products and services. But despite the shortage of available spectrum, if you actually go out and take measurements, as my students have done, you will find that at any given time and given location, much of the spectrum appears to be idle. How could that be? Well, it is in part because policies that may once have made sense have not kept pace with changing technology. And that means there are opportunities to make policy changes that will alleviate these sorts of problems. So rather than write an academic tome here, I was trying to think of a handful of things that you could do, that a government could do in what, with my academic hat on, we would say is a very short period of time, with policy circles, what we would consider a fairly long period of time. Basically, what could you do in 2 to 4 years that you could expect to make substantial progress on? And I proposed 4 specific things. First of all, if you're going to talk about making more spectrum available, it's hard not to talk about the entity that has by far the most spectrum for anybody else in this country, and that, of course, is the federal government, which has enormous amounts. And anecdotally, there are some reasons to believe that the federal government uses that spectrum pretty inefficiently. But I say anecdotally because we're not sure, because much of the information that would allow you to really understand that is kept secret. In fact, it is kept secret from those who might push for change. It is also kept secret, ironically, from many of the entities that might actually be able to help to find new ways of sharing spectrum, for example. So a way a lot of well-meaning past governments, including the Bush administration, have worked on dealing with this is they've got a bunch of very smart people together in a room, and they've said, try to think of ways we can improve what we're doing. And I have great respect for some of those very smart people, but I would suggest that the opposite approach is perhaps what we ought to be doing. We ought to be bringing real transparency to this process. We could do an inventory of federal use, make that available freely, and then make that a basis to go forward and find new methods of making spectrum available. Federal government is not the only big user of spectrum. There are local governments are also involved. In particular, I was thinking of public safety agencies who have much smaller allocations, but in fact use them very inefficiently. Again, local agencies are making intelligent choices based on what they see in their local environment, but you have 50,000 agencies, and it's very hard to use a national resource efficiently with 50,000 uncoordinated agencies. If we had a nationwide system that served all federal, state, and local emergency responders, we could be vastly more efficient. We need a system that was, if you want to replace old systems and free up spectrum, you'd need a new system that is as good or better than the old, not just sort of something of marginal quality that is a supplement. And if you did that, you could free up a lot of spectrum. People obviously ask about money. In the short term, this would cost billions of dollars, but given how vastly more it costs to run thousands of independent systems, it would actually save money just a few years down the line. And if saving money and saving spectrum isn't compelling enough, by the way, it would also save lives, enhance public safety and homeland security. A third area that I spoke about was advancing spectrum sharing. Particularly, I spoke about what seemed like the most near-term opportunity, which is more sharing in the TV bands. This was written last spring. It never occurred to me that by the end of 2008 we might actually move on sharing of spectrum bands, much less that I would be at the Commission when it happened. But some of you may know that in November of 2008 the Commission ruled to allow much more sharing in what some people call the television white space. But I would point out that this was the beginning of the process, not the end of the process, and there is more to be done here. And finally, I suggested we might change the way spectrum is auctioned. At the moment, if I go for a license and I win, I will end up making a very large one-time payment for spectrum. This means I need to have deep pockets to participate. Instead, you might have a system where if I win, I make a much smaller payment every year as long as I own the spectrum, or excuse me, so as long as I have the spectrum licensed. This wouldn't free up spectrum, but it would make it available to a lot more entities. It would also create a steady revenue stream for U.S. Treasury, and it would remove some of the temptation to push forward or push back on auction timing based on CBO accounting rules as opposed to the needs of wireless and spectrum users. So those are my 4 near-term suggestions, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Rob Frieden, professor at Penn State University. My presentation follows up on spectrum and pays particular attention to wireless. And for most of us, wireless is a great success story. It's indispensable. People get withdrawal symptoms if someone takes away their handset, and I think that refers to our president. And I guess most of us here as well. If I took away your handset, you'd be upset. This third screen is increasingly indispensable and follows on the heels of the second screen, the personal computer terminal, and the first screen, the television set. And we're very pleased with the progress apparently. But I'm here to tell you we could do a lot more, and we could achieve a lot more with regulatory reform. In the United States, we have some of the highest rates for service. An example of that would be texting. 10 cents per text puts us at the uppermost level. Of course, you can have a rate plan if you're willing to pay $10, and the text rate becomes pennies or less than pennies. Highest average return per user, very low bit rates. And the U.S., quite frankly, lags in terms of innovation and rural penetration. What are the killer applications for wireless service in the United States currently? It's voice, it's ringtones, it's texting. Look at what the carriers are pitching in their advertisements. A mature industry where the ads are still saying, it works, it works. More bars and more places than there's this Verizon posse that keeps following me. I hear footsteps. So, the proof of this lagging is a comparison of what's available out in the European Union and Asia Pacific. I mean, that's where you see a variety of location-based e-commerce applications, credit cards. The cell phone is a Swiss Army knife, and admittedly, maybe some of those applications we don't want to use, but they're available. We have 4 carriers in the United States that control over 90% of the market. We have a great handset subsidy, which on one hand subsidizes access to shiny new devices every 2 years or so, but in exchange for that, you're locked into higher rates that recoup that subsidy. Locked handsets, what are called walled gardens, which restrict the availability of content and applications. Walt Mossberg at the Wall Street Journal sort of likened the carriers, the wireless carriers, to Soviet ministries in the sense that they really control how you use that handset. And there's some progress. The Apple App Store has 10,000 applications, and that's better than 100 or better than 1,000. But if you're going to use a PC model, why should there only be a quota of 10,000? Verizon talks about an open network, and at least they're aspiring to that, but here you have applications access controlled by or specified by manufacturers and carriers. And worse yet, the FCC has the regulatory tools to promote competition and access, but it assumes that the marketplace is so competitive that it doesn't have to do anything, that the market can self-regulate. What to do? Well, I've got 7 that I'll briefly mention here. There are more in the chapter. I think the first thing to do is that stakeholders, including the FCC and Congress, need to recognize that this third screen, this wireless handset device, is going to become a platform for all things ICE, information, communications, and entertainment. Technological and marketplace convergence means that handset is really going to be a key for a lot of things in the ICE arena, and if that device is controlled by others or restricted, then its utility and value to us is reduced or minimized. And I don't think anybody would respect that kind of restriction on their personal computer, or for that matter, their wireline handset. There's a great need for transparency in market assessment. Quite frankly, the FCC has had what I'd call cockeyed false optimism about the virtues of the marketplace and the ability to self-regulate. They've certainly overstated in their reports to Congress and the public how wonderful things are and how competitive the marketplace is. Wireless carriers are treated as common carriers in name only. They're telephone companies. Yes, I'd welcome streamlined regulation, particularly as the marketplace evolves and becomes more competitive. But we have a concept for wireline handsets called Carterphone, which says you can own your own phone, you can attach fax machines and any device that's not harmful to the network. I think it's a no-brainer that kind of policy should extend to wireless handsets. Yes, there's a spectrum connection as opposed to a wired connection, but I think engineers are capable of dealing with that and coming to common air interfaces. It's important to exploit the efficiencies of wireless for universal service reform and for broadband development, and the Universal Service Fund policy has to recognize wireless in that respect. There's a greater need for scrutiny of mergers and acquisitions. Just recently, the FCC approved the Verizon acquisition of Alltel. That added about 2% market share to the big four. We're now over 90% market share, and somebody's going to have to tell me how that merger served the public interest, promoted competition, and whatnot. Certainly helped Verizon's bottom line and payouts to Alltel executives and shareholders, but Where's the public interest there? Lastly, it's important to look at wireless as a technology that can be shared, white spaces, extension of Wi-Fi type sharing concepts, unlicensed operation. And last but not least, and this is something that is near and dear to probably every consumer's heart, there ought to be greater enforcement of existing laws and scrutiny of truth in billing and other consumer safeguards, closer scrutiny of early termination fees and line charges, and quite frankly, federal preemption of those kinds of safeguards probably is ill-advised. So I think I have 30 seconds. I reserve the balance of my time. Thank you.
Okay, now for something completely different. I think it's probably true that we haven't been in a period of national crisis and perhaps paradoxical optimism in policy since President Johnson's Great Society. And during that period, as you know, we passed the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. So what better time than to throw that act away and rewrite it for the new media era? I think that one of the things that's perplexing about the Public Broadcasting Act and about our system of public media is that it's very difficult to say clearly what its purpose is and exactly what its mission is. But if you look at the findings of that act and mission statements that the public broadcasting entities have issued and the structure of public broadcasting itself, I think you can find three purposes. One is to provide universal service of a sort, although we don't call it that. And I'm focusing on television, 350 public broadcast TV stations in all 210 markets. Secondly, to be an incubator of talent, a sponsor of experimentation, what you might call a curator of American cultural excellence. So innovation, in a sense, but innovation of a particular sort of non-commercial, mission-driven kind. And then third, related to that, to promote democratic engagement with that content universally. So since 1967, there have really been no major changes to our structure of public broadcasting. Of course, public broadcasting stations and the system as a whole have done a lot to push content onto new platforms and are taking advantage of social networking and Web 2.0 interactivity and public user participation. But the system is still structured around an increasingly obsolete transmission technology of broadcasting. Now I know Michael Calabrese is here, and he could put a much better number on this. But by back of the envelope calculations, just based on recent auctions, public broadcasters, public television broadcasters, are sitting on about $20 billion worth of spectrum, and this relates to the question that was asked about the Negroponte switch. Why don't we switch over from broadcast TV to other transmission mechanisms? We have to think about public broadcasting in that context as well. There's really a paltry amount of federal funding that goes into public broadcasting, but a large percentage of what does goes into sustaining the infrastructure, the broadcast transmission infrastructure of public broadcasting. So that's been the same since 1967. The battles have basically been the same too, ricocheting between arguments for zeroing out funding and increasing funding. Efforts to change public broadcasting from within and from without have foundered on fractured and sometimes fractious public broadcasting community and a lack of will or constituency for reform. So I think what we need going forward in this period of optimism, hopefully well-founded optimism, is a new structure for public media, not public broadcasting, and a new conception of its purpose. I think those three goals are still relevant and apt, but need to be modernized. So universal service. Well, we've been talking about universal service all morning, and generally we're talking about broadband, not broadcast. So I don't think the system of local broadcast stations can be defended anymore as a tool or mechanism of universal service. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to have a local presence for public media, but that local presence does not necessarily need to be tied to a transmission system of broadcasting, to towers and equipment and those sorts of capital expenditures. I think it was McCarthy, was it from Mr. McCarthy from, or Professor McCarthy from Georgetown asked about the crisis in journalism. I think that's absolutely one of the main justifications for public media going forward, is being a sponsor of high-quality journalism, and a local presence for public media can assist in that. Second, the whole sort of innovation market failure justification for non-commercial public media. I think there's still plenty of market failures, especially you see it in high-cost investigative journalism, documentary filmmaking. We need to work on a consensus, could be arrived at in lots of ways, including sort of a new Carnegie Commission, but other ways too, report, but other ways as well. A consensus on what the market failures are, what needs funding. There is massive amounts of experimentation, as we all know, happening at the net roots without any federal assistance, or often without any foundation or any other kind of financial assistance. The long-tail distribution and collective creativity are providing outlets and opportunities for experimentation, but it's happening on commercial platforms in a heavily advertised media space and mediated by commercial and non-transparent search engines. All of this suggests that there's a role for public non-commercial media, not only in sponsoring content, but also in providing a role of mediator. And then the function of democratic engagement, I think, remains necessary, but it needs to shift into developing media literacy skills, fostering engagement with public issues at local and national levels. Even could think about a non-commercial recommendation engine or search capability. So, to my policy recommendations. First, a new Public Media Act would have a new orientation to be platform neutral, not broadcast centric. It would distribute funds in the form of grants to a wide range of grantees, not necessarily or principally local broadcast stations. Associated with that, we'd have to have a new coordinating entity, could be a reformed CPB or some new entity. And then finally, there are areas of the copyright law that also need to be reformed that are particular to public broadcasting that would foster and support more open, easier acquisition of rights and also more open sharing of rights in the public media space. Thank you.
All right, I'm Catherine Montgomery from American University, and since I'm last in this long list of presenters, I'll try to be brief. But I'm very happy to be part of this project because I'm talking about children's media policy, and usually children's issues are not included in the broader telecommunications policy agenda. And yet members of this so-called digital generation are key stakeholders in many of the policy issues that have been addressed in the book and in the presentations that you've heard this morning. However, since the launch of the World Wide Web, which is more than 15 years ago, a whole lot of the public policy debate over children and new media has been dominated by concerns over indecency and child safety and online predation. These things have continued to capture the press attention and the public imagination and the focus of policymakers. So even though the Child Online Protection Act faded into obscurity this last week when the Supreme Court refused to review the case after the law had been declared unconstitutional. The issue continues to surface, and there's a huge amount of energy, and there's some groups that are calling for an online safety czar in the new administration. I think that the long-standing obsession over online safety has overshadowed a broader set of issues and obscured our understanding of how young people are interacting with new media. And we know that they're growing up in a pervasive and immersive 24/7 digital media culture that some call a digital media ecosystem, which has become a pervasive presence in their daily lives. The other very important thing is that digital media tap into the key developmental tasks of childhood and adolescence, into identity exploration and developing relationships with peers, friendships, and becoming more independent from parents and from authority. These new digital media have become indispensable tools for young people for expression, for interaction with others, and more recently, particularly for citizen participation. Only a few years ago, experts were wringing their hands about the decline in voter participation by young people and their not being involved in the democratic process. And I think the last two elections have shown very, very positive signs in terms of trends of re-engagement by young people. Particularly the campaign by President Obama's team, which included their mobile strategy that some have called Text We Can, I think really demonstrated the power that digital media are playing, such a central part of young people's lives, and the part that it's playing in participatory politics. And I think we need to seize this historic moment to develop an agenda on behalf of young people in digital media. My focus in the paper for this volume has been on ensuring fair marketing practices in the emerging digital marketplace. But it's not the only issue I care about, but it's the one I've focused on. I have outlined the proposals. I'm not going to go into them in detail. I'll just highlight them very quickly. And I've outlined them not only in the paper, but in a memo to the Obama transition team for the FTC, and the copies of that paper are outside. Two areas I think are particularly urgent and particularly important at this time. One is ensuring online privacy safeguards, and the other is creating some rules to govern interactive marketing of food and beverage products, and all interactive marketing for that matter, but particularly products that contribute to childhood obesity, which is a great concern. During the 1990s, I led a coalition of child advocacy, consumer, and education groups, along with colleagues in the room here, to do a campaign, to complete a campaign that ended in passage of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And that law has been in effect since then. However, it only protects children under the age of 13. And in the meantime, there's been an explosion of digital technologies and digital marketing, with Web 2.0 ushering in a whole new era of behavioral profiling and data collection. There have been a number of consumer groups, the Center for Digital Democracy, Electronic Privacy Information Center, and US PIRG, that have called on the Federal Trade Commission to develop some regulations and some rules to address the issues of online privacy. They are particularly important for not only for children, but also for adolescents who are really living much of their lives online and often don't really fully understand the extent of social media marketing and behavioral profiling that's taking place. And so what I urge are a clear set of guidelines to govern marketing practices and to get those into place at this point, at the beginning of this new digital marketplace. And the other issue, as I mentioned, is in light of the childhood obesity crisis, to find a way to address the growing interactive marketing practices that food and beverage companies are using to target children and adolescents. I co-authored a report that is online at digitalads.org that lays out the panoply of marketing practices, from mobile phones to instant messaging to live interactive video games to virtual three-dimensional environments. And the Federal Trade Commission has been looking at the issue of food marketing, but hasn't paid enough attention to this one. And so we're calling on the Commission to develop a set of safeguards there. Finally, marketing policies are only a part of what I see as a much broader research and policy agenda on behalf of young people. And among the issues are many that have been discussed: universal access to broadband, funding for non-commercial and public platforms, and particularly support for independent research on how young people are interacting with new media. I really believe that this generation can help the country tackle many of its very pressing problems, but we need to make sure that there is a communication system in place to support them. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Well, we're open now for questions, and Andy, please. Sasha will bring you the microphone.
Hi, Andy Schwartzman from Media Access Project, and I would be remiss if I didn't comment on the overall value of the work being done here. I just think this is a tremendous job you guys have done. My question is really for Ellen Goodman. You talked about public broadcasting, but at least in your remarks today, it was directed mainly, implicitly, but mainly at television. And I wonder if you have any thoughts in the chapter about the role of non-commercial radio, and in particular the localism of non-commercial radio, and also the prospects for low-power FM and expansion of low-power FM.
Ellen, the other mic. Yeah, these are for the TV, these are for the...
Andy, I focus on TV for two reasons. One is because that's what I know. I just don't know much about public radio. And two, because I think the opportunity costs are so much greater in TV than in radio, just because radio doesn't use very much spectrum. And the sale of the radio spectrum wouldn't generate significant enough revenues to really. There's a whole funding element here to fund a trust fund for public broadcasting, etc. So I wouldn't mind if public radio continued in its broadcast form, and from everything I've heard, low power FM does provide some great opportunities for diversity. So I think I'm supportive.
Please, Jim.
Two questions. First one for John. John, you're a veteran of the Spectrum Wars. For example, I recall in 1999 you worked for Representative Dingell, the ranking minority member of the Commerce Committee, and then Senator Wyden, and you wrote as a young academic a 20-page paper on spectrum policy. I remember seeing it then, and I thought it was actually a very politically astute set of recommendations on spectrum policy, but I still think you had zero success in getting people to follow your recommendations. So having had all this, I don't want to say bitter experience, but experience with how spectrum policy and politics really work, what advice would you have going forward to put some big issues on the table, dealing with that reality?
I've never seen him speechless before.
I'm not going to review all the things I've not been successful at. There's we have a limited time period here. There have been successes. There have been changes over the last few years, white space, secondary markets. I think, actually, if you compare, you're right, I've been writing about this since the early 90s. I have, in my comments today might reflect the fact that when I'm out of academic circles, I talk a lot more about near-term and things that I think are achievable, looking at where the stakeholders are and where the policy is, whereas I go back to my academic circles and I talk about long-term and bigger vision issues. And I think focusing more on what can be done and looking at incremental steps rather than drastic ones, I think is part of how we're going to move forward.
And then one question for Ellen. Ellen, you're a real serious scholar in this area. You've been laboring for a long time. You haven't played the DC game, and you labored in obscurity for many years. Finally now, people here are paying attention to you. Are there any recommendations that you might make for speeding up the rate at which people like yourself who work in obscurity and don't try to play the game can get recognition for your ideas in this community?
I don't quite get it. Are there any recommendations I have for what?
For
How to get more publicity? For
how to get people that
Yeah.
labor and make important contributions, but people don't really read scholarly articles in this community. They don't subscribe. They
Well,
don't
we
read.
have a meet. Everything a meet's doing. I mean, that's what this. I think
Well, we are
that's-
doing it here,
yeah.
but it's you wrote some seminal papers, a half a decade ago or more, and they just weren't part of the debate until
Yeah.
recently.
Look,
You don't see a problem. Yeah.
I think you're asking me the same question you asked John. Like, why are we so irrelevant? I don't. What's that? Hold up your book. Yeah, no. Well, I've done that. I said, we're doing it now, right? I think there's a right time for everything. I don't know that now is the right time. I thought you were going to say is you've written all these great ideas about public broadcasting. Dream on. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. There's no constituency. There's no political will, etc. And I think even in this period of optimism, I will be back in another half a decade, and you can ask me the same questions.
Can I respond to that? Because I think it's a broader question as well, and that is, how do we foster stronger and better relationships between the academic community and the advocacy community and the policymakers? And since I've been part of both the advocacy community and the academic community, I'm particularly sensitive to this issue, and I think this is a very good step in that direction. I think the advocates need to do more, and I think the academics need to do more. I think we need more support for ways to share research, because there's a lot of enormously valuable work going on in the academy that many of the advocates could benefit from. And I know there have been efforts in the past, but I think that more needs to be done, and I think this is a really good moment to see new efforts in that way.
Please.
Philip Weber, Congressional Budget Office. This is for John Piha. A straightforward technology question, since you're the technologist there. The House Appropriations Stimulus Package in their broadband has pretty heavy speed requirements. 1 megabit down, 3 megabit down, 1 megabit up on wireless, and wireline I think is 10 and 40, if not 10 and 50. How much is that going to slow things down in terms of getting money out the door? It is a stimulus package.
All right. That is not a straightforward technology question. Clearly, these things are technically achievable. There is no question that they are technically achievable. The higher the standard, also actually it's not, there are multiple definitions and exactly what is required. Maybe you're following the progress of the bill better than I am, but it's not clear to me yet. There are what there are is performance cost trade-offs, and requiring a lot more may or may not. If you go too far in that direction, you won't get anybody to bite. Of course, if you don't go far in that direction at all, you pay a bunch of money to have people do what they would have done anyway, and you get nothing. And there is a balancing act that needs to be done. And there is room here for very good engineering economic analysis that really looks at both the business case and the technology and the cost of the infrastructure. I hope it's being done as part of the stimulus package, but that's happening on a different part of Washington, D.C. than where I'm sitting at the moment.
Sasha, down here.
I guess I should stand. Joanne Wilson with Compass Rose International, and let me just say, since we're a consulting firm, my question reflects my own thoughts and opinions and does not reflect that of my firm or any of our clients. just to be clear. Most of the discussion that I've heard over the years about spectral efficiency, following up on that, really talk more about spectral utilization. You know, how can I share bands? How can I have more applications using the same band, maybe, and so forth. But they never really talk about what I'll define efficiency in terms of being able to do more with the same amount of spectrum or with less. And so from that standpoint, when you see bills that say I want to have, you know, so many megabits of speed up and down, you know, people naturally infer from that that more spectrum is required, as opposed to inferring that I need to be able to put that amount of bandwidth, data rate, through the same amount of spectrum. So my question goes to, do you see any efforts not to, in terms of spectrum policy, to drive more efficient use of the spectrum in the context of more data rate through the same amount of spectrum, as opposed to more people trying to share the same spectrum bands? And on those questions of technology, I'll also admit I'm an electrical engineer in the telecom sector, and so that those technologies do exist and they are in use, but as we've noted, they're in use in other countries, and that's why you're seeing the differences in our cost versus others.
Well, first of all, we are certainly talking about trying to get more, I should say more useful. Useful is also important. More useful communications done with the same amount of spectrum. Sometimes that actually means taking things that could have been done better with a piece of fiber and doing it that way and getting it out of the spectrum entirely. Sometimes it means increasing sharing and thereby getting more done with the same amount of spectrum. You're also saying in some cases it might mean doing no more sharing and the same amount of stuff, but reducing your spectrum requirements. If we're talking about building out infrastructure that covers a large area, which is, I think, the subtext there, and also the previous question. Actually, the most fundamental trade-off is I can do that easily by reducing the distance from the transmitter to the receiver, which means I have to build more transmitters, which means I have to spend more money. Okay, you can also do this through modulation techniques and antennas. Is that what you're talking about? Okay, ad hoc networks, someone said it brings a lot into play here, both a lot of new challenges and a lot of new opportunities, and there's work going on there. I think ad hoc networks aside, because that's a whole different model and a very interesting one, for the non-engineers, most of what we're talking about here, I would take back to a money versus spectrum trade-off, which is important. You know, if I use handsets with better antenna gain, I pay for that. You know, how do I want to work this trade-off? I want to get as much through the spectrum as possible, and I want to also build as much as I can with minimum subsidy. So those are the trade-offs we're grappling with. Certainly, you see, forgetting the new builds, there are people using more and more efficient technologies, and I hope that will continue.
One quick follow-up on that, and could you also address whether or not the FCC should put back the spectrum cap?
I'd be glad to answer that. I think
and John will be glad that you're answering that.
Right. Well, your question raises the trade-off in carriers' minds. Do they invest in technologies, compression technologies, to operate more efficiently, or is there just more spectrum there to go after? If you're an incumbent government user, I mean, maybe there's no incentive to operate more efficiently because that spectrum would be targeted perhaps for commercialization. If you don't have spectrum caps on the commercial side, maybe there's an incentive to warehouse spectrum, to acquire more spectrum than you need, which would shut out facilities-based competitors. So from my mind, and I'm not a sponsored researcher in this respect, it strikes me that spectrum caps would promote facilities-based competition, and in the cellular arena, maybe you have a fifth carrier, a sixth carrier. Places like Hong Kong have 6, 7, 8 facilities-based carriers, partly because no single incumbent can warehouse the capacity and foreclose competition.
Mike?
Michael Nelson with Georgetown University. This is a question I actually wanted to ask to both panels, but that wasn't possible. Gene Kimmelman started off by making what I think is a false dichotomy between more regulation and deregulation. And he made the point that we've seen this financial collapse because of deregulation, and that we've seen similar problems in the telecom sector because of this deregulatory approach of the Bush administration. I think it's actually a lot more subtle than that, and we have good regulation and we have bad regulation. And for the last 8 years, we've seen a lot of bad regulation, inconsistent regulation, incumbent players using the regulatory process at the state and federal level to game the system. So they favor themselves, block new players, block innovation. The chapters in this book are great for framing opportunities for government to do things that will help spur better development of the infrastructure, new uses for the infrastructure. But my question for this panel, and anybody else who's listening, is how do you do that and ensure that we end up with good regulation? Over the last 8 years, the number of people who go to the Federal Communications Bar Association's dinner every year has actually increased pretty substantially. We haven't seen deregulation. We've seen more people getting more billable hours on all these issues because we've got more inconsistent regulation to argue over. How can we ensure that the process, the regulatory process, leads to fewer billable hours, more consistent regulation in the next years?
I think it's a great question, and I think the first step is to change the FCC's processes. We've talked about transparency a lot. Anyone who practices has anything to do with the FCC knows that the ex parte system is a mess, that it's designed for transparency, but it's not transparent at all. Just fixing that to make it transparent, to know who's going into the commission and what they're saying, I think would change the rulemaking process significantly. I also think, and this goes back to the question about the sort of fact-based, the use of academics or other fact finders and fact-based rulemaking. So, what happens now is that because all the major decisions are decided after the rulemaking is closed and during the ex parte process, it's often not fact-based, and there's no time to respond to the most significant components of the record. And if it were more fact-based, and so there was at the National Press Club a few weeks ago, there was a whole session on reforming the FCC, and I thought one of the most interesting proposals was connected to how can academics be more relevant, was when the FCC issues its notice, it should have a whole list of questions it needs answered, factual research it needs done, and get that in actually during the notice and comment period. So I think that would help.
Following on to those thoughts, we in the Academy have something called peer review. Peer review is the scrutiny by third parties to make sure that we haven't cooked the books and our sponsors haven't convinced us to believe in something or assert something as an economic rule or as the gospel truth when it's not. So peer review, transparency, subjecting research to scrutiny, often by disinterested third parties, is an effective sort of counterbalance against the just proliferation of sponsored research. Sponsored research is research where sponsors fund research with an end goal in mind, and the researcher is more than obliged to achieve that outcome.
Okay.
I'll just follow strongly on Ellen's comments, which are important, that the more fact-based the decision-making process is, the more predictable the decision-making process is. One thing I'd say, while there are, I believe, other ways one could go out and solicit facts, there are actually a lot of, if you look at the NPRMs, they ask a lot of questions. And if you look at the record, a lot of them aren't answered. So, there may be an awful lot of lawyers and putting in billable hours, but they're not doing it, as best I can tell, doing hard analysis that will help make for good, solid, objective decision-making. Some of them are, but an awful lot of them aren't. And a culture of fact-based decision-making, which could be, led from the top and followed all around, I think would make a very big difference.
Okay. Ariel?
Hi, my name is Ariel Lemon. I'm from the University of Maryland, Philip Merrill College of Journalism. I have a question for Ellen and for, is it Catherine? You mentioned, Ellen, that you might consider a non-commercial recommendation engine for the internet, which I think is an interesting idea, particularly as it might affect young people. Has anyone ever thought of trying to enlist the help of Google or the private search engine companies in coming up with something that's a little more geared toward the public and public welfare? Has anyone thought about doing kind of a public-private partnership and coming up with a new algorithm, new search engines, more access to public media as opposed to the kind of viral, fragmented media that the young people are so fond of? I mean, I'm concerned as a journalist, as other people have been here, that part of the problem with our technology is it is fragmenting our audiences and deconstructing, you should pardon the expression, objective journalism. Print is going down. And it seems to me that if we're going to attack monopoly practices, Google is the new Microsoft when it comes to the internet. It rules the internet. And I'm just wondering, how do you encourage competition when that search engine is so pervasive and they are sucking the majority of advertising dollars away from other institutions?
Yeah, well, I mean, a few points there. I think the premise of your question is right, that it's very hard to build an alternative to Google that can scale. Whether or not anyone has approached them about this, I don't know, and I'm going to let Catherine talk about that, because I think if anyone did, it would be the Center for Social Media at AU, which is really has the best contacts in this area. But Google really has a conflict with doing something like that, because Google is all about neutrality, right? They have an algorithm that spits out the most popular things, and that they don't take a side on sort of what's valuable content or what's mission-driven content. The whole idea of a public media engine or toolkit would be that it would have a particular mission, it would have a vision, and it would take a side on sort of what is what counts as democratic engagement or should be highlighted.
I don't know of any particular partnerships. I mean, we do know that the YouTube is now creating, kind of C-SPAN, its own C-SPAN. That raises some issues for me. There's been a kind of an embracing of YouTube as the video medium for the digital era. But I agree with you that it does have an enormously powerful monopoly, and there have been consumer groups calling on regulators to investigate this. I do think it is important that we have policies that will ensure competition. I'm also a little bit skeptical, though, of a kind of public partnership I think we have to be willing to explore a lot of different options. I do believe we need very strong support for the public mission, the public values that have mattered so much and that have been at the core of public broadcasting, and find a way to translate those into the digital era, particularly for young people. But I'm somewhat skeptical of alliances with some of the private companies like Google, whose business model clearly is based on marketing and profiling and data collection, and there's just an enormous amount of money to be made here. So the question is, how do you...
But they are eroding. It is a monopoly at this point.
Yes.
This is a search engine monopoly.
No, I agree with you.
Just the way Microsoft's lousy operating system became the standard for American computers. So it seems to me that there could be a case built that something has to be done.
Yes, I agree.
To level the playing field to a degree. I mean, they just made a better search engine than everyone else. But now when we talk about walled gardens, and in the name of maintaining neutrality, we're essentially giving one company hegemony over the internet. And I think it's a little scary.
I agree with you. I'm completely in agreement. And there are consumer groups working on these issues. So, the Center for Digital Democracy, for example, and EPIC, Electronic Privacy Information Center, are working specifically on those issues.
Any more questions? Wow, the audience has become also extremely... one more. Okay, we have some voices of dissent. Okay.
Could I ask the wireless guys to say a little bit about ad hoc networks? And I realize that's a long-term thing, not a short-term stimulus, but do you see any future possibility in congested areas for wireless with that, and or whatever you might care to say about it?
Sure, ad hocs have, networks undoubtedly have a future, although we don't quite know the scope of what what its importance is. They're already, this is a way you deal with mobile infrastructure. If you want to go in after the hurricane, you want an ad hoc network. I'm guessing that the harder question is whether ad hoc networks can be a true substitute for, say, microcellular networks. And I think that's a race both in technology and in the market we need to see. On the positive side, there is the potential to build out systems with much greater capacity at lower cost. There are also some real security challenges. I start to rely on my neighbor for connectivity, and I don't know what my neighbor's incentives or practices are. There are real network management issues. Can you achieve the same quality? Personally, I would like to see, both kinds of networks move forward, and we need to see, we simply need to see where they go.
More broadly, on a structural sense, both at the international level, at the International Telecommunication Union, and then domestically at the FCC and the national level, a lot of spectrum still is allocated on a service-specific basis. So we've got the ability to operate with portable devices, but we have spectrum that's allocated for aeronautical, in the air, for maritime, on water, or for on land. So more structurally, the allocation process has to become more flexible to allow toggling between applications.
I guess we have time for one more question. We have one more hand up. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Peggy Siegel, an education free agent, and I have a content question for Catherine and Ellen primarily. House Education and Labor Committee Chair George Miller has been quoted as saying, we have digital native students in an analog education system. And I'm wondering if you see an opportunity to take the implications of that, which is really a revolution in teaching and learning, into a policy discussion that hasn't really recognized the ramifications for that when we talk about federal policy, teacher effectiveness, small schools, early childhood, Pell Grants, etc. How to fast track the emergence of redefining the teacher-student-parent relationship and the policy-making implications in resource allocation as well. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think it is a very important opportunity. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, so much of the debate has focused on online safety that what we've seen are, even recently, legislation that puts more pressure on educators to focus on safety, whether it's requiring filtering software if you're participating in the E-rate or educating about online safety, which becomes an incredibly narrow way of addressing the whole issue. But I think that the emergence of digital media and the way that young people are so incredibly involved with it, and it's so much a part of how they live and learn, really does call for a reexamination of our education policies. I mean, I think there are a number of things that we do in education. I'm in higher education. I don't teach at the secondary level or the elementary level, but I'm a parent, and I know that there is much more we could do there in terms of support for training, for different ways of looking at education and how we provide rewards and so forth, how we evaluate what is good teaching and good learning. And I think that digital media could play an important role in that discussion.
Yeah, I would just add that public media is a natural partner there and always has been. These are called non-commercial educational stations, and public broadcasting has always done a lot with schools and educational materials. But I would say that there's no reason why it has to be broadcast, that should be in any way connected to a broadcast transmission, a system of stations. And instead, you can imagine, I know, Mark Nadel, you have ideas about how to do more digital production for schools. There's that public media grants could go to all sorts of innovative programs that are working with schools.
Okay. I would like to point out that there are half of the chapters in this book were not even addressed today. And other members of the group, that could not come, and we decided to pick on these 8 topics that we did today, but there are discussions of some of these issues that have been brought up here in other chapters as well. The universal service question, there are 2 more chapters about that, including one about municipal broadband. Issues of the type you've raised about media. There was a media ownership chapter that Philip Napoli contributed. So there's more in the work if people are interested in reading, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to share with Washington. I want to at this point I really want to thank Sasha and New America for all the work and support in putting this event together, and I'll give Sasha the final word. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amit. Let me just thank the staff, especially Cecile Isidro and Stephanie Gunter, who have been doing logistics behind the scenes to ensure that everyone had a good time here today, and especially the panelists here who did such a great job, and C-SPAN out there. Yes, gentlemen, you know who you are, and ladies in the back. Thank you so much for coming out here and doing such a wonderful job. And thanks to all of you, and in particular to Amit, who spent 1.5 years of his life to document this information at this critical juncture in telecommunications history. Thank you all.